before God was imagined as a being, a ruler, or a judge, before religion gave him a personality, God already had a meaning, an older one, a meaning so abstract, so foundational, that it didn't describe someone watching the world, but something the world itself emerged from. And once that meaning was lost, everything else had to change with it. You see, most people assume the idea of God has always meant more or less the same thing, but historians of philosophy and religion know that isn't true. Across the ancient world, long before Christianity, God didn't refer to a person who ruled reality. It referred to the principle that made reality possible, not a being among beings, not a judge above the world, but the source beneath it. Tonight, we're going back to that original definition, before belief hardened into theology and meaning became someone. So let me know where you're watching from, and let's dive in. Picture this. You're sitting in a philosophical school in Athens, around 300 BCE. The air smells like olive oil and parchment. Someone stands up and asks the question that's been asked for centuries. What is God? Here's what happens. No one describes a figure sitting on a throne. No one talks about a king issuing commands. No one mentions anger, jealousy, or love. Instead, everyone talks about principles, the good, the one, that which is, being itself. Not metaphors for a person. Actual philosophical categories, describing something that couldn't be a person, because personhood itself was something that needed explaining. See, in the ancient Mediterranean world, divinity wasn't primarily understood as someone. It was understood as the condition that made someone possible in the first place. This wasn't poetry. This was precision. When Greek philosophers used the word theos, often translated as God, they weren't always referring to Zeus or Apollo or any of the mythological figures. In philosophical contexts, they were pointing to something else entirely, the ultimate principle of reality, the foundation beneath all foundations. And this principle had specific characteristics that made it radically different from what most modern people imagine when they hear the word God. First, it had no emotions, not because it was cold or distant, but because emotions require change. You move from calm to angry, from satisfied to disappointed, but the ultimate principle couldn't change. If it changed, that would mean it depended on something else to cause that change. And if it depended on something else, it wouldn't be ultimate. It would just be one more thing in a chain of things. Second, it had no preferences. Preferences imply choosing one thing over another, which implies limitation. You prefer this because you lack that. But the source of all things couldn't lack anything. Whatever exists had to, in some sense, come from it. So preference made no sense. Third, it had no will in the way we understand will. Will implies deciding between options, weighing alternatives, choosing a course of action. But decision implies time, a before and after. The ultimate principle existed outside time. It didn't decide to create the universe the way an architect decides to build a house. It simply was. And reality followed from that being, the same way light follows from the sun. This is where the language gets strange to modern ears. Ancient thinkers described divinity as beyond being, beyond essence, beyond knowing. Not because it was mysterious in a mystical sense, though it was that too, but because every category we use to describe things didn't apply. Things are large or small, the divine wasn't. Things are here or there, the divine wasn't. Things are good or evil, the divine transcended both. It wasn't good in the moral sense. It was good in the metaphysical sense, the principle that made goodness, truth, and being intelligible at all. Imagine trying to describe the concept of up to someone who's only ever experienced flatness. You wouldn't say up is a thing over there. You'd say up is the direction that makes vertical space possible. That's closer to how ancient thinkers talked about God, not as a thing within reality, as the ground of reality itself. And here's where it gets interesting. If God wasn't a person, then phrases like God loves you or God is angry weren't describing divine emotions. They were describing the human experience of encountering ultimate reality, the way a plant might be said to seek the sun, not because it has desires, but because its nature orients it toward the light. This model solved problems before they became problems. If God is the principle of being, not a being, then the question, who created God, disappears. Principles don't get created. They simply are what makes creation possible. If God is the source of intelligibility, not an intelligent being, then the question, how does God think, becomes incoherent. Thought is a process that happens within time. The source of time doesn't think. It makes thinking possible. If God is that from which all things emerge, not a craftsman who shapes things, then the question, why did God create a world with suffering, transforms entirely. You're no longer asking about the motives of a designer. You're asking about the structure of existence itself. But all of this raises an obvious question. If God wasn't a being, if there was no personality, no emotions, no will in the traditional sense, then how did people relate to it at all? How do you pray to a principle? How do you worship the good? How do you have a relationship with that which is? The answer shaped everything that came after. You might be wondering, if this impersonal principle was the dominant understanding of divinity, why does it sound so foreign now? The answer isn't that people back then were more philosophical or more abstract. It's that this model actually worked better, functionally, intellectually, spiritually, than the one that replaced it. Let's walk through why. First, it explained order without requiring command. When you think of God as a ruler, you immediately have to explain how that ruler enforces order. Does he intervene constantly? Does he set up laws and step back? Does he punish violations? Each answer creates new problems. If God intervenes constantly, then human free will becomes questionable. If he steps back, then he's either negligent or limited. If he punishes, then you have to explain why punishment is delayed, inconsistent, or seemingly arbitrary. But when God is understood as the source of being, order isn't imposed from above, it emerges from within. Think of it like this. The sun doesn't command light to shine. Light is what happens when the sun exists. You don't need enforcement. You don't need intervention. The relationship between source and manifestation is immediate, natural, and necessary. In the same way, ancient thinkers understood that order, beauty, and structure in the universe weren't the result of divine micromanagement. They were the natural expression of reality flowing from its source. Second, it explained presence without requiring surveillance. The idea of God as a ruler watching over creation leads to strange implications. Is God literally observing every moment? Is he aware of every sparrow that falls, every thought you think, every choice you make? If yes, then you're describing something that sounds more like omnipresent surveillance than loving care. If no, then God isn't truly omnipresent. He's just very powerful and very aware. But when God is understood as the ground of existence, presence isn't about observation. It's about being the condition for presence itself. You exist within God the way a wave exists within the ocean, not because the ocean is watching the wave, but because the wave is made of ocean. There's no separation that would require bridging, no distance that would require surveillance. God isn't present to things. God is that in which presence happens. This is why ancient philosophers could speak of divine immanence, God being fully present everywhere, without imagining a cosmic Big Brother scenario. Presence wasn't attention. It was the ground of existence itself. Third, it explained unity without imposing hierarchy. When God is a ruler, you immediately create a pyramid. God at the top, angels below, humans below them, animals below us, plants at the bottom, everyone in their place, everyone under authority. This creates political theology. Obedience becomes the primary virtue. Rebellion becomes the primary sin. The cosmos becomes a kingdom, and kingdoms require subjects. But when God is the source, hierarchy collapses into degrees of manifestation. Think of light moving through a prism. The prism doesn't rule over the colors it creates. The colors aren't subjects of the light. They're expressions of it. Different frequencies, different manifestations, all equally light. In the same way, ancient thinkers understood the cosmos as degrees of emanation from the One. Not levels of obedience, but levels of complexity. Humans weren't lower than angels because we were less obedient. We were different because we manifested the divine principle through different structures, reason, emotion, physical form. Everything was connected not by command, but by shared origin. This had radical implications. If everything shares the same source, then the divine isn't foreign to you. It's not above you, judging from a distance. It's the deepest truth of what you are. Your consciousness, your awareness, your ability to think and know, these aren't gifts from an external God. They're echoes of the source expressing itself through you. Fourth, it solved the problem of divine action without divine change. Here's a puzzle that troubled later theology. How does God act in time if God is eternal? If God is eternal, he doesn't experience before and after. But if he doesn't experience time, how does he respond to prayers, intervene in history, or change his mind? Every answer creates contradictions. But when God is understood as the source, action doesn't require change. The sun doesn't decide to warm the earth each morning. Warmth is what happens when the earth is in relation to the sun. The relationship is constant, but the effects vary depending on the conditions. In the same way, ancient thinkers understood divine action as the natural consequence of reality existing in relation to its source. God doesn't intervene from outside. Reality continuously flows from the divine principle, and what looks like intervention is actually the natural working out of that relationship. This is why prayers weren't petitions asking God to change his mind. They were alignments, ways of orienting yourself toward the source, so that the natural flow of divine reality could move through your life more clearly. Not manipulation, recognition. Fifth, it explained knowledge without requiring revelation. If God is a person separate from you, then knowledge about God has to come from outside. He has to reveal himself through prophets, scriptures, miraculous events. This creates gatekeepers, people who claim special access, institutions that control the message. But if God is the source of intelligibility itself, then knowledge of God isn't foreign information delivered from outside. It's the deepest possible understanding of the structure of reality. You don't need a revelation to tell you that 2 + 2 = 4. You recognize it. You see it. It's self-evident once you understand the concepts. In the same way, ancient philosophers believed that knowledge of the divine was available to anyone who developed the capacity to see it, not because they were special, but because the divine was the ground of knowing itself. The capacity to understand was already the divine expressing itself through you. This is why philosophy and spirituality weren't separate disciplines in the ancient world. They were the same project, coming to know reality as it actually is, which meant coming to know the source from which reality emerges. So here's what we're looking at: a model of divinity that explained order without command, presence without surveillance, unity without hierarchy, action without change, knowledge without gatekeepers. It wasn't just elegant, it was functionally superior to every model that came after it, which raises the next question. If this understanding was so widespread, where did it come from? What you're about to see is a pattern, not a conspiracy, not a secret teaching passed down through hidden channels, just a pattern. Across different cultures, thinkers kept arriving at the same basic framework for understanding ultimate reality, and once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start in Athens, around the 4th century BCE. Plato writes about something he calls the good. Not good in the moral sense, good as in the principle that makes things intelligible, valuable, real. In his Republic, he describes it carefully. The good, he says, is beyond being. It's not a thing that exists the way a chair or a person exists. It's the condition that allows existence itself. He uses the metaphor of the sun. Just as the sun makes physical things visible without being visible in the same way those things are, the good makes all things knowable without being knowable in the same way. It's the source of truth, being, and intelligibility. Plato never calls this a God in the personal sense. He describes it as a principle, ultimate, foundational, and utterly beyond the categories we use for ordinary things. Now move forward a few centuries. In Alexandria, Egypt, a melting pot of Greek philosophy and Jewish thought, a thinker named Philo is trying to reconcile the God of Moses with Greek philosophical language. And what does he do? He describes God as the source of all being, beyond all categories, unknowable through ordinary thought. God, Philo argues, is accessed through the logos, the divine reason or principle through which ultimate reality becomes intelligible to human minds. Not a God who thinks, the principle that makes thinking possible. Not a God who speaks, the structure that makes meaning possible. Philo is doing for Jewish theology what Plato did for Greek philosophy, identifying the ultimate not as a being, but as the source of being. Now jump ahead to the 3rd century CE. A philosopher named Plotinus, building on Plato, building on centuries of development, articulates this framework with startling clarity. He calls it the One. Not one as in the first number. One as in absolute unity, that from which all multiplicity emerges, but which itself has no parts, no divisions, no distinctions. The One, Plotinus argues, is beyond being, beyond thought, beyond language. You can't say it is anything, because being is something that comes from it. It's not good, it's beyond good. It's not conscious, it's beyond consciousness. It doesn't create the way a craftsman creates. Reality simply flows from it the way light flows from the sun, necessarily, continuously, without decision or will. And here's what's critical. Plotinus isn't inventing this. He's systematizing what had been implicit in Greek thought for centuries. He's naming what others had been circling around. 3 different contexts, 3 different thinkers, 3 different vocabularies, but the same basic structure. Ultimate reality is not a being. It's the source of being. It's not personal. It's the ground of personhood. It's not something you relate to as an external authority. It's the principle from which all relationship emerges. Now here's where the pattern gets interesting. This wasn't just a Greek thing. The framework appears in Jewish mysticism, where God is described as Ein Sof, the infinite, beyond all attributes, beyond all names. It appears in early Christian mystical thought, where God is beyond being and beyond knowing. It appears in Hermetic texts, where the One is described as the mind that knows itself through all creation. It appears in mystery traditions, where the goal of initiation wasn't worshiping a deity, but recognizing the divine principle within yourself. Different cultures, different languages, different frameworks, all converging on the same insight. Ultimate reality is source, not sovereign. And later philosophy gave this convergence a name, the One. But here's what you need to understand. The One wasn't a religious dogma. It wasn't a belief system. It was a philosophical description of what ultimate reality would have to be if we thought clearly about it. If you ask, what explains everything else, but doesn't need explanation itself, you arrive at something that has no parts, no changes, no dependencies. You arrive at absolute unity. If you ask, what's present in all things without being one of those things, you arrive at something that's not located in space or time. You arrive at the ground of presence. If you ask, what makes knowledge possible, you arrive at something that isn't just true, but is truth itself. You arrive at the principle of intelligibility. This wasn't mysticism in the sense of vague spiritual feelings. This was rigorous philosophical reasoning about what the word ultimate actually means. And the conclusion kept being the same. Ultimate reality cannot be a being, because beings are contingent, located, limited. It has to be the source from which being emerges. Now the critical question becomes, was this just philosophy, just abstract speculation for intellectuals? Or was this the actual metaphysical grammar of the ancient world, the default framework through which educated people understood divinity? The answer might surprise you, because it wasn't just philosophers, it wasn't just mystics, it wasn't just a few marginalized groups. This was everywhere. If you had told an educated person in the ancient Mediterranean world that God was the source of all being, rather than a being among beings, they wouldn't have looked at you like you were crazy. They would have nodded. Because across philosophy, mysticism, and even popular religious thought, this was the grammar people used. Let's walk through it. Start with the Pythagoreans, a philosophical and religious community that existed centuries before Christianity. Their core teaching was simple. Reality begins with unity. They called it the monad. the one from which all numbers, all forms, all structures emerge. Not one thing, one as a principle. The monad wasn't a god in the sense of a personality. It was the mathematical and metaphysical foundation of existence. Everything that existed, every form, every number, every relationship, was an expression of this original unity differentiating itself. Multiplicity didn't contradict the one, it flowed from it. Think of it this way: the number 2 doesn't destroy the number 1, it emerges from it. 3 emerges from 2, 4 from 3. All numbers are ultimately expressions of the original unity that makes counting possible. The Pythagoreans understood the cosmos the same way. The divine wasn't a being among beings. It was the principle that made beings possible, the unity that manifests as multiplicity without ever ceasing to be one. Now move to Hermeticism, a body of mystical and philosophical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, blending Greek and Egyptian thought. In the Corpus Hermeticum, God is described as the One, or the All, or the Mind. Not a person thinking, but the principle of mind itself, that which knows itself through creation. One passage describes it clearly. God is not mind, but the cause of mind existing. God is not spirit, but the cause of spirit existing. God is not light, but the cause of light existing. Notice the structure. God isn't categorized as anything. God is the source from which categories emerge. And the goal of Hermetic practice wasn't worship in the traditional sense. It was gnosis, knowledge, recognition, alignment with the divine principle that was already the deepest truth of your own consciousness. You weren't trying to please an external deity. You were trying to wake up to what you already were. Now consider the mystery schools, Eleusinian, Orphic, and others scattered across the ancient world. These weren't philosophical academies. They were initiatory traditions where people underwent ritual experiences designed to reveal divine truth. But what truth were they revealing? Not the existence of a god. Everyone already believed gods existed. The mysteries revealed the nature of ultimate reality, the source beneath the gods, the principle behind the myths. Initiation didn't teach you to worship. It taught you to see, to recognize the divine not as something external, but as the ground of your own being. This is why the mysteries were secretive, not because the knowledge was dangerous in a threatening sense, but because it was transformative. You couldn't just tell someone, they had to experience it. And what they experienced was the recognition that the divine wasn't elsewhere. It was here, now, as the very awareness through which you experienced anything at all. Now, let's be careful here. Judaism approached divinity differently than Greek philosophy. The God of Israel was personal, covenantal, active in history. But even within Jewish thought, there were mystical undercurrents that understood God in strikingly similar terms to the philosophers. Long before Kabbalah formalized this thinking, Jewish mystics spoke of God as beyond all names, beyond all forms, beyond all attributes. When Moses asks God for his name, God responds, "I am that I am." Not a name, a statement of pure being. As mentioned before, later Jewish mysticism would develop this into the concept of Ein Sof, the infinite, the limitless, that which has no attributes because it transcends all categories. And here's what's important. This wasn't considered heretical. It was considered the deepest truth about God, so deep that ordinary language couldn't capture it. God was infinite, and infinity by definition cannot be defined. Even the name God was a placeholder, a word pointing towards something that language couldn't contain. This kept continuity with the philosophical framework we've been tracing. God wasn't just powerful. God was the principle of being itself. Now let's look at something that might surprise you. Early Christianity. Before theology crystallized into creeds and doctrines, there were Christian communities deeply influenced by this same framework. The Desert Fathers, Christian monks and mystics living in the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries, practiced a form of spirituality centered on silence, stillness, and direct awareness. They called it hesychasm, stillness, quietude, inner silence. Their goal wasn't to think about God, but to rest in the awareness that was itself divine. not because they claimed to be God, but because they understood consciousness as the point where the human and the divine met. God wasn't encountered through theological arguments. God was known through the direct experience of presence, awareness itself, stripped of thought, image, and concept. This wasn't heresy. This was Christianity before theology hardened into rigid categories, and it fit perfectly within the ancient framework. God as the source of being, known not through belief, but through the recognition of what you already are. So here's the pattern we're seeing. Pythagoreans, the monad, the one from which all multiplicity flows. Hermeticism, God as mind, the principle of knowing rather than a being who knows. Mystery schools, initiation into the recognition of divine reality as the ground of existence. Jewish mysticism, God beyond name, beyond form, infinite and indefinable. Early Christian mystics, God known through silence, stillness, and awareness. Different vocabularies, different practices, different contexts, but the same metaphysical structure underneath. God equals source. God equals unity. God equals awareness, presence, the ground of being. God does not equal ruler, judge, or external authority. This wasn't a fringe belief held by a few eccentric philosophers. This was the default metaphysical grammar of the ancient world. But what were they actually pointing to? What is the one thing that fits all these requirements, beyond being always present, indivisible, making all things knowable without being a thing itself? The answer makes the entire framework click into place. So we've established that ancient thinkers across multiple traditions converged on the idea of God as source rather than sovereign. But there's still something missing from this picture. If God isn't a being, if God has no emotions, no preferences, no will in the traditional sense, then what is God? You can say the principle of being, or the one, or the source of reality, but those are still abstractions. Is there something concrete we can point to that fits all the requirements? There is. And once you see it, everything else falls in line. The answer is awareness. Not awareness of something, not consciousness as in a conscious being, but awareness itself, the capacity for knowing, the space in which experience happens. Let me show you why this works. First, awareness is not a thing among things. You can point to a table, a person, or a star, but you can't point to awareness. It's not located anywhere. It doesn't have size, shape, or color. It's not made of atoms. It doesn't exist in space. And yet, it's the only thing you've ever actually encountered. Everything you've ever experienced, every thought, sensation, perception, emotion, has appeared within awareness. You've never experienced anything outside of it. This fits the requirement that God is not a being among beings. Awareness isn't one more object in reality. It's the field in which objects appear. Second, awareness is always present, but never changes. Your thoughts change, your emotions change, your body changes, your circumstances change. But the awareness that knows these changes doesn't change. It's the same awareness that was present when you were 5 years old and will be present when you're 90, not because it endures through time, but because it exists as the space in which time is experienced. This fits the requirement that God is eternal, unchanging, beyond time. Third, awareness has no parts. You can divide matter. You can divide space. You can even divide time into moments, but you can't divide awareness into pieces. There's no half of awareness, no section of knowing. It's indivisible, whole, complete. This fits the requirement that the divine is absolutely one, the unity from which multiplicity emerges but which itself has no divisions. Fourth, awareness is intimately present to everything, without being any particular thing. Right now, you're aware of these words, but awareness isn't the words. You're aware of your breathing, but awareness isn't the breath. You're aware of sounds, sensations, thoughts, images, but awareness isn't any of those things. It's what makes all of them knowable to you. This fits the requirement that God is omnipresent, fully present everywhere, without being located anywhere. Fifth, awareness requires no effort. You don't have to try to be aware. You can't turn awareness off. Even in deep sleep, there's a subtle knowing. Otherwise, you couldn't wake up and say, I slept well, or I had a nightmare. Awareness simply is. It doesn't labor, it doesn't strain, it doesn't decide to exist. This fits the requirement that the divine doesn't do things through will or decision. It simply is, and reality flows from that being. Now here's where it gets profound. If God is understood as awareness, not a being who is aware, but awareness itself as the divine principle, then several things that seemed mysterious become immediately clear. Omnipresence stops being surveillance and becomes presence. God isn't watching you from a distance. Awareness is the very medium in which your existence happens. You exist within awareness the way a wave exists within the ocean. There's no separation, no distance, no need for monitoring, because you're already utterly intimate with the divine. Omniscience stops being cosmic information gathering and becomes immediate knowing. Awareness doesn't learn about things. Things appear within awareness, and in their appearing, they're known. There's no gap between existence and knowing. If reality exists within divine awareness, then God doesn't need to figure out what's happening. The happening and the knowing are the same event. Authority stops being command and becomes alignment. Awareness doesn't tell you what to do, but the more clearly you recognize awareness as your own deepest nature, the more naturally you align with what's true, good, and real. Not because you're being obedient, because you're being yourself. This explains why ancient sages didn't talk about worship in the modern sense. They talked about recognition, awakening, gnosis, not as belief systems, but as the direct seeing of what's already true. And here's the most radical implication. If God is awareness, then the divine isn't foreign to you. The awareness listening to these words right now, the knowing that's present in this moment, isn't separate from the divine principle. It's not that you have awareness. It's that awareness is what you most fundamentally are, and that awareness is the same awareness that's the ground of all existence. Not pantheism, not everything is God, not solipsism, not I am God, but the recognition that consciousness, awareness, knowing, these aren't products of biology that happen to exist in your skull. They're the reflection of the divine principle, expressing itself through this particular form. This is what the mystics meant when they spoke of union with God. Not that you merge with an external being, but that you recognize what you've always been. This is what Jesus meant when he spoke of the Father being in him and he in the Father. This is what Plotinus meant when he described the soul's return to the One. This is what the Upanishads meant when they declared, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that, not as metaphor, as metaphysics. The divine isn't elsewhere. It's the awareness in which elsewhere appears. But if this is true, if God is the source of being, if awareness is the divine principle, if ultimate reality is consciousness rather than a cosmic ruler, then how does creation fit into all of this? That question leads somewhere unexpected. We've been talking about God as source, as principle, as the one from which reality emerges. But how do we explain the world we actually live in? Because this world, the material world, with all its structures, limitations, laws, and conflicts, doesn't feel like the direct expression of an infinite, perfect source. It feels ordered, yes, but also constrained. Beautiful, yes, but also violent. Structured, yes, but also trapped. Ancient thinkers noticed this too, and they made a distinction that later got buried under layers of theology. They distinguished between the source, the ultimate principle we've been discussing, and the principle that governs material reality, not because there were two gods competing for power, but because emanation creates degrees, and each degree has its own character, its own function. Think of it like this. The sun is the source of light, but by the time that light reaches the earth, it's been filtered, refracted, dimmed. It's still light, but it's not the pure radiance of the source. In the same way, many ancient systems understood that the material world was related to the ultimate source, but not its direct expression. There was a mediating principle, something that stood between the infinite and the finite, between the one and the many. Some systems called this the logos. Others called it the demiurge. Others simply referred to it as the world soul or the craftsman. The role was consistent. This principle ordered reality. It gave structure to matter. It established the laws that governed time, space, causation, and form. But it didn't create from nothing. This is crucial. In most ancient frameworks, creation wasn't understood as God speaking reality into existence from absolute void. It was understood as organization, shaping, ordering pre-existing potential into manifested form, like a sculptor shaping clay or an architect designing a building. The material is already there. The creative act is giving it structure, purpose, limitation. Now here's where theology later diverged from philosophy. In Jewish and Christian orthodoxy, the God of Genesis creates from nothing, ex nihilo. There's no pre-existing material, just the command, "Let there be light." But in the philosophical traditions we've been tracing, that didn't make sense. If the ultimate principle is beyond action, beyond will, beyond decision, then it can't command creation. Creation would have to emerge from its nature, not from its choice. So the governing of the material world, the imposition of limits, the establishment of structure, was attributed to a secondary principle, not secondary in importance, secondary in the order of emanation. And here's what's fascinating. This wasn't considered a problem. It was considered necessary, because if the ultimate source is infinite, then finitude can't come directly from it. Something has to mediate between infinity and form. This solved several puzzles. It explained why the world feels limited without limiting the source. It explained how divine perfection could give rise to an imperfect world without blaming God. It explained why order exists without making the ultimate principle into a craftsman. Now, we're not going to unpack this fully here. That's for another conversation. But what you need to understand is this. Ancient thinkers didn't assume that the source and the ruler were the same. They recognized different levels of divine activity, different principles operating at different scales of reality. And that recognition changes everything about how we read ancient religious texts, including the words of Jesus. Let's go back to something we touched on in a previous conversation. Jesus used language that later theology struggled to explain. He spoke about the Father constantly, but never as a distant monarch, always as intimate, immediate, present. He said things like, "I and the Father are one," and "the Father is in me, and I in the Father." He said, "If you've seen me, you've seen the Father." He said, "You are God's" to his audience. He talked about the kingdom of God being within you, not above you. Orthodox Christianity read these statements and created complex doctrines, the Trinity, the hypostatic union, two natures in one person. But what if Jesus was simply speaking within the framework we've been tracing? What if Father wasn't a title for a cosmic ruler, but a precise philosophical term pointing to the source? Let's work through this carefully. In the ancient framework we've been discussing, the ultimate principle, the one, the good, the source, was sometimes referred to using parental language, not because it was literally male or female, but because father and mother were the clearest metaphors for source relationship. A father doesn't create a child from nothing. A child emerges from the father, sharing his nature, his being, his essence. It's an emanation, not a construction. When Plotinus describes the One, he uses similar language. The One gives birth to reality, not through will or decision, but through the overflow of its own nature. So when Jesus calls God Father, he's not necessarily describing a personality. He might be using source language, pointing to the ultimate principle from which all being flows. This immediately makes several of his statements clearer. I and the Father are one. If the Father is the source, and Jesus recognizes his own consciousness as an expression of that source, then unity isn't a claim to exclusive divinity. It's a recognition of origin, just as light and the sun are one, not identical, but inseparable. The light is the sun's expression, the sun's manifestation in the world. The Father is in me, and I in the Father. This is the language of mutual indwelling that makes no sense if you're talking about two separate beings, but it makes perfect sense if you're talking about source and expression. The ocean is in the wave, and the wave is in the ocean. Not metaphorically, actually. The wave is made of ocean. There's no separation. In the same way, if consciousness is the reflection of the divine principle, then the source is in you and you are in the source. Not as two things that merged, but as one reality expressing itself at different levels. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. This statement baffled Orthodox theology. How can seeing Jesus mean seeing God the Father if they're separate beings? But if Jesus is speaking as awakened consciousness, as someone who has fully recognized the source as his own deepest nature, then the statement is precise. Seeing awakened consciousness is seeing the divine principle, not because Jesus is claiming to be the only manifestation, but because he's the clearest expression his audience has encountered. It's like saying, if you've understood this equation, you've understood mathematics. Not that the equation is mathematics, but that it perfectly demonstrates the principle. You are God's. This is the statement that almost got him stoned, according to the Gospel of John. But notice, he doesn't say, you are God. He says, you are God's, using the plural, using language that points to shared nature, not exclusive identity. In the ancient framework, this isn't blasphemy, it's ontology. If the divine principle is awareness, and awareness is your deepest nature, then you are divine, not in the sense of being the source itself, but in the sense of being its expression, just as every ray of light is light, even though it's not the sun. The kingdom of God is within you, not above you, not in heaven, not in a future age. Within you. This makes no sense if God is a ruler whose kingdom is a place, but it makes perfect sense if God is the principle of being, and the kingdom is the recognition of that principle as your own nature. The kingdom isn't elsewhere, it's here, now, as the awareness in which this moment appears. Now here's what's critical. I'm not claiming this is what Jesus definitely meant. We don't have access to his internal understanding. But what we can say is this: his language fits perfectly within the ancient philosophical framework we've been tracing. Father as source, union as recognition, divinity as shared nature, the kingdom as interior awareness. None of this requires new theology. It just requires remembering old metaphysics. And if this was the framework Jesus was using, then the next question becomes unavoidable. What happened? How did God as source become God as sovereign? How did recognition become obedience? How did philosophy become theology? So far, we've traced a framework that was widespread, philosophically rigorous, and functionally elegant. God as source, not sovereign. Principle, not personality. Awareness, not authority. And we've seen how this framework fits perfectly with Jesus' language. So what happened? Why did Christianity develop in a completely different direction, toward God as a person, a ruler, a judge who demands worship and punishes disobedience? The answer isn't a conspiracy. It's not a cover-up. It's something much simpler: cognitive and social necessity. Let's start with the cognitive problem. Abstraction doesn't scale. You can explain to a philosopher that God is the principle of being, or that from which reality emanates, or awareness itself. A trained thinker can work with those concepts. They can meditate on them, reason through them, build coherent frameworks around them. But most people aren't philosophers. Most people need something concrete, something relatable, something they can picture. Tell someone God is the infinite source of being, and you'll get blank stares. Tell them God is a loving Father who cares about you, and you'll get immediate emotional connection. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's how human cognition works. We understand through analogy, through narrative, through relationship. Abstract principles feel distant, cold, incomprehensible. Persons feel close, warm, understandable. So when Christianity spread beyond philosophical circles into the broader Roman Empire, into communities of merchants, soldiers, slaves, farmers, the abstract framework had to be translated. And the most effective translation was personhood. Not because it was more true, but because it was more accessible. This created a second problem, the relationship problem. If God is an impersonal principle, how do you relate to it? You can contemplate it. You can align with it. You can recognize it as your own nature, but you can't talk to it. You can't ask it for help. You can't feel loved by it. And human beings desperately need relationship. We're social creatures. We're wired for connection, for dialogue, for reciprocity. A principle doesn't reciprocate. A source doesn't respond to your prayers. Awareness doesn't comfort you when you're suffering. But a person does. A loving father listens, a caring shepherd guides, a merciful judge forgives. So personhood wasn't just cognitively simpler, it was emotionally necessary. Scholars who study the development of religious thought have noted this pattern across multiple traditions. Early sophisticated metaphysics gradually gives way to more personalized relational theology, not because people become less intelligent, but because religion serves more than just philosophical truth. It serves community cohesion, emotional support, moral guidance, meaning-making. And for those functions, personhood works better than principle. But there's a third factor: institutional necessity. An impersonal God creates a problem for religious authority. If the divine is awareness, and awareness is accessible to anyone who develops the capacity to recognize it, then you don't need mediators. You don't need priests to intercede. You don't need bishops to interpret. You don't need a church to control access. Everyone has direct access to the source, because everyone is the source expressing itself. This is spiritually liberating, but institutionally catastrophic. How do you build a church around the idea that everyone already has what they're seeking? How do you create hierarchy when the framework itself collapses hierarchy? How do you maintain authority when knowledge is self-evident rather than revealed? You can't. So personhood wasn't just easier to teach and more emotionally satisfying. It was structurally necessary for the kind of institution Christianity was becoming. A personal God can have representatives, priests who speak on his behalf, bishops who interpret his will, a pope who serves as his vicar on earth. A principle can't. This doesn't mean the early church fathers were cynical or manipulative. Most of them genuinely believed they were protecting truth, maintaining unity, preventing heresy. But the truth they were protecting had already been translated. God as source had become God as sovereign. Principle had become person. Recognition had become obedience. And once that translation was complete, the original framework became difficult to see, like trying to read a text through layers of painted-over glass. You can still glimpse it, but only in fragments. Certain mystics kept the old framework alive: Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, Pseudo-Dionysius. They spoke of God beyond being, beyond knowing, beyond attributes. They were sometimes condemned as heretics, sometimes tolerated as overly mystical, but rarely understood as preserving the original metaphysics, because by then, the translation was complete. God was a person. Jesus was his son. Salvation was through belief and obedience. The ancient framework, God as source, consciousness as divine, recognition as salvation, had become so foreign that even reading it back into the original texts felt like innovation rather than recovery. Now here's the difficult question. Was this change a loss or an adaptation? Did Christianity lose something essential by replacing principle with person? Or did it gain something necessary by making the divine accessible to everyone? Probably both. Personhood made God relatable, emotionally present, morally engaged. It created communities of care, structures of meaning, frameworks for ethics, but it also created problems that the original framework didn't have. It made God into a being who could be questioned, blamed, rejected. It created the problem of evil. Why would a loving, powerful God allow suffering? It created the need for mediators, hierarchies, gatekeepers. It turned recognition into obedience, awakening into belief, gnosis into faith. And it obscured the possibility that had been obvious to ancient thinkers, that the divine isn't elsewhere, watching from above, but here, now, as the awareness in which this moment appears. But here's what might be the deepest insight. The problem wasn't personality itself. The problem was forgetting that personality was a translation, not the original text. If you know that God as Father is pointing to source language, then the metaphor works. If you forget that it's a metaphor and take it literally, then you end up with a cosmic ruler who doesn't quite make sense. And that's where we've been for centuries, trying to make sense of a translation while the original sits buried beneath it. Which leads to the final piece. Let's think through the implications. If God is understood as the source, as awareness, as the principle of being, rather than as a personal ruler, then several things that seemed necessary in traditional theology become unnecessary. Not wrong, not evil, just structurally irrelevant. Let's start with the obvious one: mediation. In traditional Christian theology, there's a gap between humanity and God. God is holy. We are sinful. God is perfect. We are flawed. God is transcendent. We are fallen. That gap creates a problem. How do we cross it? The answer Christianity developed: we can't. We need a mediator. Jesus becomes the bridge, the one who is both God and human, who can stand in the gap and reconcile us to the Father. The Church becomes the institution that administers that reconciliation, through sacraments, through teaching, through authority. But notice what happens if God is understood as source rather than sovereign. There's no gap, not because we're already perfect, but because the source isn't separate from us in the first place. Awareness isn't something you need a bridge to reach, it's what you already are. The divine principle isn't located somewhere else, requiring someone to bring you to it. It's the ground of your own existence. Think about it this way. If someone said, "You need a mediator to connect you with your own consciousness," you'd look at them strangely. Your consciousness isn't separate from you. It's not something you need help accessing. It's the very medium through which you experience everything. You might need help recognizing it clearly. You might need practices that help you notice what's always been present, but you don't need someone to grant you access, because you've never been separate from it. In the ancient framework, this was understood. The divine wasn't elsewhere. It was here, as the deepest reality of what you are. The problem wasn't separation. It was recognition. Not, how do I reach God, but how do I wake up to what I already am? This changes the entire structure. Spiritual practice stops being about earning favor and becomes about clearing obscurations. Prayer stops being petition and becomes alignment. Salvation stops being rescue and becomes awakening. You don't need someone to save you from separation, because you were never separate. You need help seeing clearly. Now, does this mean there's no role for teachers, guides, or communities? Not at all, but the role changes. A teacher isn't someone who has special access to God that you don't have. A teacher is someone who has recognized clearly what you haven't yet recognized, and can help you see it too. Like someone who's solved a puzzle helping you see the pattern you're missing. They're not giving you something foreign. They're pointing out something that's already present. In the ancient mystery schools, this was the function of initiation. The mysteries didn't grant you access to the divine. They revealed what was already true. In philosophical schools, this was the function of the teacher. Not to mediate between you and truth, but to guide you toward recognizing it yourself. In early Christian mysticism, before theology hardened, this was the role of spiritual fathers and mothers. Not to intercede with God on your behalf, but to help you recognize the presence that was never absent. But there's a second implication: no hierarchy. If the source is accessible to everyone equally, not because everyone is equally developed, but because everyone is equally made of the same principle, then hierarchy collapses. Not social structure, not organization, not the practical reality that some people know more than others, but spiritual hierarchy, the idea that some people are closer to God, more favored by God, more able to access God. That can't exist if God is the ground of being. A wave isn't closer to the ocean than another wave. One wave might be larger, more powerful, more beautiful, but both are equally ocean. In the same way, one person might be more awakened, more clear, more aligned, but both are equally expressions of the divine principle. This doesn't erase difference, it just removes the cosmic ranking system, and that has radical implications for religious authority. If no one is structurally closer to God than anyone else, then authority can't be based on proximity to the divine. It can be based on wisdom, on clarity, on skill at helping others recognize truth. But it can't be based on exclusive access. This is why early Gnostic and mystical Christian communities often had flatter structures than Orthodox churches, not because they were anarchists, but because their metaphysics didn't support hierarchy. If everyone has the divine spark, if everyone is capable of gnosis, if everyone can recognize the source directly, then the only authority that makes sense is the authority of those who have recognized it, helping those who haven't yet. Functional authority, not cosmic authority. Now, there's a third implication: no gatekeeping of knowledge. If truth about the divine isn't revealed from outside but recognized from within, then knowledge can't be controlled. You can't lock away gnosis the way you can lock away a sacred text. You can't excommunicate someone from their own awareness. You can't make access contingent on belief, obedience, or membership. This is why institutions built on the God as ruler model have historically struggled with mysticism. Mystics keep pointing people back to direct experience, to inner recognition, to awareness itself. And institutions need to control the narrative, maintain boundaries, preserve authority. The two impulses are structurally incompatible, not because mystics are rebels, many of them were deeply devout, but because mysticism based on the source model doesn't need the architecture that theology based on the ruler model requires. So here's what we're left with: a model of divinity that requires no mediator because there's no gap, creates no hierarchy because everyone is equally grounded in the source, needs no gatekeepers because knowledge is recognition, not information, not because it's better morally, but because it's structured differently metaphysically. And that different structure explains why this understanding was eventually marginalized, reinterpreted, or forgotten. It couldn't support the institutions that were being built. So Christianity didn't invent the idea of God. It inherited one. But over time, the meaning of that word shifted, from principle to person, from source to ruler, from awareness to authority. Jesus' language wasn't wrong. It was older than the theology built around it. When God is understood as consciousness, not a being, the contradictions disappear without argument, not because one side wins, but because the original framework returns. And that framework doesn't demand belief, it invites recognition. Yet another question inevitably emerges. If God, or what we refer to as God, is the source of being, not a ruler within it, if the ultimate principle does not govern, command, or create directly, then who does? That question haunted ancient thinkers just as deeply, and it may be the missing piece in how religion, power, and creation became entangled in the first place. If you're enjoying this series, leave a like, subscribe, and stay tuned for our next video. Until next time, keep questioning.